And then okay. 2 more seconds here. All right, welcome everybody to a Free Thinkers Corner, Books and More, and soon to be the gallery at a Free Thinkers Corner as well. We're hoping to get that going soon. Our guest today is Johanna Stoberock from Washington, and don't worry, she's all safe from the fires right now. Her new book we have in store, it's backwards, but Pigs. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a quick, a little bit about her book here, some of the reviews. So from Booklist, Stoberock explores the toll on the planet of everything we casually throw away and an economic system that suppresses the hopes, dreams, and desires of so many. This is an allegorical text that brings to mind Kafka's darker stories or Cormac McCarthy's The Road, not only for the shocking violence and some beautiful prose, but also like Kafka and McCarthy's fiction, because the intended allegory is opaque. So the novel can be read in several ways, as about the climate crisis, general debt, immigration, and much more. But perhaps most remarkable is that, as well as building a rich, fable-like world, Stoberock simultaneously weaves an engrossing and breathless narrative about the human capacity for both destruction and survival. And I got one more here from Kirkus Review. Expressive, a deeply strange take on our quickly developing environmental changes that fall somewhere between Lord of the Flies and The Maze Runner. Lyrical and artfully written fable. And with that, I'm excited to read it. I haven't read it yet, but it was recommended by a customer, so that's why we have it. You can get it here. Plus, each one comes with a signed book plate, which you can stick in the book, so therefore it becomes a signed copy. And for the rest of it now, I'll turn it over to Johanna. Welcome.
All right, thank you so much for having me, Chris. I wish I could be visiting Dover in person, but this is definitely the next best thing. So I'm excited to share a little bit about my novel, Pigs. It has a fabulous premise to get at issues of environmental and social responsibility. It takes place on an island that serves as the receptacle for the entire world's trash, and it follows the lives of 4 children who are tasked with gathering the garbage and feeding it to a herd of giant, magical, insatiable pigs. It's a perfect system. The world doesn't have to think about the trash that it creates. The pigs are able to make anything that gets thrown away disappear. And if they occasionally snap off a child's finger in the process, so be it. Nobody thinks about the children, and the children have no idea there's any other way for their lives to unfold. But one day a boy washes to shore in a barrel, and when the children have to decide if he's garbage meant to be fed to the pigs or just another child like them, the story gets going. So I thought what I'd do today is read from the very beginning of the novel to give you a sense about the world and the kind of rules by which it operates. And then I thought I'd read a little bit from the second chapter that introduces a character who I feel very close to. And then I thought I would end the reading by reading a series of very, very short chapters. Some of them are as short as 1 paragraph that kind of punctuate the novel throughout. And I think the whole reading will take about 15 minutes. The pigs ate everything: kitchen scraps, bitter lettuce from the garden, the stale and sticky contents of lunch boxes kids brought home from school, toenail clippings, hairballs pulled up from the drain. After the pigs were done, there weren't even any teeth left over, not even any metal from cavities filled long ago. They lived in a pen out back. The land was rocky but spacious, and the pen had been tucked in a corner out of sight for more years than any of the children could remember. It was made out of wood, gray splintered boards nailed together in a haphazard way. Every 5 feet, the wood was anchored by posts. When you stood by the fence, the pigs lumbered over, grunting, and stuck their snouts out between the rickety slats. It wasn't always that they expected food. Sometimes they just wanted their snouts scratched. Sometimes they just grunted happily and settled back down in the shade. There were 6 of them. They never fought. They seemed to smile when you approached, but you had to be quick. If you brought a bucket of slop and poured it out too slowly without moving your hand away, you never knew what could happen. Louisa was missing a finger. Not an important one, just her left-hand pinky where she hadn't moved away quickly enough one hot summer afternoon when she was feeding them shoes. It was summer every afternoon there, soft and lazy and slow. The pinky came off in one clean bite before she even realized what was happening. She left with a feeling of shame, like it had been her fault the pig grabbed her finger. She wrapped her hand in her skirt and kept her mouth shut, and the stub didn't start hurting until she lay down for the night. The land was actually an island. The island was surrounded by water that glinted green in the sun and clouded to gray in the shade. Some might have let the pigs run free, feral among the scrubby bushes. The pigs could have rooted happily for mushrooms or truffles, found entire brambles of berries to eat, and maybe left the children alone. They could have gobbled up the entire world's detritus without anyone's help. But the grown-ups preferred the pigs confined. They preferred the relative safety of the fence. Louisa had lived on the island forever, or for as long as she could remember, which was the same as forever. There were other children too, 3 of them. Andrew, who sang in his sleep and had straw-colored hair. Mimi, who was older, or at least taller than the rest, and who liked to pretend she knew much more about the world than anyone else, and who couldn't grow her hair long no matter how hard she tried. There was even a toddler. They called her Natasha. Her head was covered with loose blonde curls. She couldn't have been more than 3. And she giggled every time she heard the grunting of the pigs. They were all afraid of the gray water, of the sea in a mood of despair. It wrapped the island like a scarf made of grief. It made you choke with tears to touch it. It didn't take long for Louisa's finger to heal into a nice, neat stump. She rubbed it sometimes and whispered to herself that it was time to grow up and stop being clumsy. It was her fault she'd lost the finger. The pigs were fast, but if she'd been a little more agile, they'd have snapped at air. She wondered what she'd tasted like. She hoped she tasted good, but not so good that the pig would want more. She tried to remember which one it was that had snapped at her, but even though she was pretty sure it was the one with black spots, she wasn't sure enough to say. Sometimes the children tested what the pigs would eat. The leather flaps of shoe tongues, the bent frames of glasses, Mardi Gras beads, tin cans, pistols, cap guns. There seemed to be no limit to their appetite. The children would stand a few feet away from the fence and toss whatever they were testing high into the air. The pigs moved with an unexpected grace, opening their long mouths and catching whatever came sailing down directly between their teeth. The pigs were remarkable. The children watched them with amazement, their own mouths open, their hands now empty, coming together of their own will to clap. Hubcaps, the tassels off bicycle handlebars, empty jars of mayonnaise, gone, all gone in seconds. The grown-ups on the island frowned at the children and never even pretended to help them with their chores. They drank espresso and smoked cigarettes and plugged their noses dramatically whenever the children got too close. As far as the children could tell, the grown-ups never cooked. When Natasha fell into the gray water and came out covered in spots and filled with an unquenchable thirst for a parent that even Mimi couldn't solve, the grown-ups flinched at the sight of her. What are they here for, Louisa said. Sometimes she thought, maybe we should just feed them to the pigs. Ships passed by from time to time, usually large cargo ships, but sometimes ocean liners. It was possible the island looked beautiful from a distance. When a ship edged onto the horizon, the children ran to the top of the highest rock and waved. They made Andrew take his shirt off, and Mimi circled it above her head. They didn't shout. They knew their voices weren't strong enough to carry all that way, and they didn't really want the grown-ups to hear them. Not that the grown-ups had ever shown they'd care. But this was private, and they'd agreed to do it in silence. Only once it seemed that they'd been sighted, but the only difference it made was that a barrel washed up on shore instead of the usual junk. They spent an entire day trying to pry it open, and when they finally got inside, all they found was another child, sleeping. His name was Eddie. So that's the opening of the novel. That's the world in which these children live, and Eddie, who sets the large plot of the novel in motion. But right at the second chapter, there's a new character who's introduced, and he's a middle-aged castaway named Otis. And I feel very close to him in that he's really the only rounded adult character in the novel. And he's somebody who kind of just throws his life away over and over. And I just feel so much sympathy and kinship for this sense of just realizing you're making bad decisions at the moment that you're making them and just not being able to stop yourself. So I thought I would just read the chapter that introduces him. Otis couldn't stop crying, even though he knew he was wasting whatever liquid his body had left. His eyes were full of sand. The tears washed the grit from his eyes, which was some consolation, but not enough. At least it restored vision, which after 5 days drifting on the lid of a packing crate at sea was a pretty big deal. If he lifted his head slightly from where it was wedged into the sand, he could see the coast, rocky, dry, dotted with bursts of purple flowers pushing out of cliffs. Maybe enough driftwood on the beach to build a shelter. There were birds, seagulls anyway. They stood in a line and looked at him. He could swear they were looking right at him. He thought he heard a dove. He crawled away from the water, and his body left a long track behind him on the sand. He had no idea how long it took to be able to stand up, but it happened. At one point, his cheek was shoved against a rough pillow of sand, and at the next, he was standing with his knees shaking, the breeze from the ocean on his neck. Even though it had happened 5 seconds ago, he couldn't say how he'd gotten from one position to the other. Something rubbed against his throat. He felt his hand. He lifted his hand and felt the smooth surface of a metal pendant. A necklace? He remembered he'd had a necklace. The chain was heavy against his battered skin. He dragged driftwood into a pile. He hobbled to the place where the sand stopped and vegetation began. He listened and heard a stream and bushwhacked through thorny bushes until he found fresh water. Then he got back down on his knees and stuck his face in and drank. Alice had once washed his hair under the bathtub faucet when he'd had the flu and was too sick to climb into the tub. It felt like that now, head in the stream, water in his mouth. It felt like someone loved him. He thought he could drink that water forever. Before too long, he started to shake again, and he thought 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. Where did he know that from? Boy Scouts? He'd learned the rule during some kind of wilderness training. Was this the wilderness? Somehow he'd always imagined wilderness to be about trees. Shelter, water, food. He cupped his palm and lifted water to his mouth and took another swallow and realized he was doing everything in the wrong order, as usual. He hobbled back through the brambles to the beach. He had more energy now, at least the water had given him that. He should stay close to the ocean so if a ship passed by, he'd see it. He needed to build a fire so if a ship did pass by and he did see it, he'd have some way of letting it know he was there. A voice at the back of his mind told him no one would care. He tried not to listen. He'd always tried not to listen to what people told him about himself. That voice had been telling him to let go the whole time he'd been floating in the ocean, and look how wrong it had been. Look where he was. He even had fresh water. The line of gulls stared at him, and one turned her head, and her eyeball glittered, and he noticed that the sun was sinking low. Night was on the way, and he was hungry. He couldn't decide what to do first, shelter or food, find more water, or build a fire. There were too many choices. Even the limited options were overwhelming. Life had always been that way for him. He'd never been able to make up his mind. He lifted his hand to the pendant at his throat and thought, this is what I do when I think. I hold this pendant. This is who I am. He fiddled with the pendant, found himself fumbling at a hinge. Not a pendant, he thought, a locket. I hold this locket and I flip its catch open and closed until I can make a choice. He pulled the locket's door open. Alice stared out at him, a smile on her long mouth, her light brown hair pushed back behind her ears. She was young in that picture, in her 20s maybe. She was wearing a flowered shirt. He remembered that shirt. He'd called her his flower child when she wore it. Across from Alice, their son stared at them from years ago. Round baby eyes, not yet a real color, a blue hat on his bald head. Otis shut the door. He opened it again. He shut it and opened it and shut it and opened it, trying to make a choice. But there wasn't really a choice. The rule of threes. It had to be shelter and soon. He shoved a couple sticks together and made a kind of lean-to. It had gaps, but if he scooted his body inside, his head was covered and only his legs were exposed to the wind that was kicking up now from the water. He could sort of see the stars through the gaps when night really fell. The stars here were just as bright as they'd been when he'd clung to wood in the middle of the ocean, just as bright, if not brighter. He couldn't even tell himself how tired he was with that voice that chattered constantly in the back of his head. Was it really telling him that his clothes were ruined? Was it really telling him he should have spent more hours at the gym? Really? Lying there, half sheltered, half exposed, he had the feeling of sinking into the ground. He used a nail he'd pulled from the crate in the ocean to notch a line into a board above him. A first day. He fell asleep trying to remember methods for making fire without a match. Flint, hand drill, bow drill, magnifying glass. There had to be other ways. He just couldn't remember. The locket was cold on his skin. So that's Otis. He ends up meeting the children and ends up trying to intervene in their lives in ways that end up costing him a great deal. But it's that kind of cost and that offering of himself for others who are more vulnerable than he is that kind of leads to his being able to save himself internally. So I'm going to end by reading a series of very, very short chapters. And I use these chapters as a way of looking at the island from the outside and also of thinking closely about things that we throw away. From a distance, the island looked so small that ocean liners moving past described it to their passengers as nothing but an unnamed, uncharted outcropping of rock. Cruise directors announced over loudspeakers that some people said it was the island where the sirens tried to lure sailors to their death. Listen closely, they said. and you'll hear something that sounds like a song. From time to time, a half-drunk divorcee jumped into the water and required rescue from irritated sailors. From time to time, passengers gathered on deck to sigh at the dark outline the island made against the orange setting sun. But nobody noticed the trails of refuse that formed a path over the water as the ship steamed on. It was official policy never to look back. It was official policy to believe the world stopped once it could no longer be seen. From a distance, seen from above, the island was shaped like a kidney. It had a wide curved side and a long indented side and two shorter, rounder ends. From sea level, it looked like a perfectly shaped mountain, all of it rising at the same angle to a peak at its very center. There wasn't any control room anywhere, no master plan for a magic island that served as the world's dump. It just was, and people just knew about it if they thought about it at all. And ships just brought their stuff there as if by instinct. Plastic bottles because no one trusted tap water, fur coats that were splashed with paint, television screens that simply weren't flat enough, weight loss and weight loss competitions, mothers' wedding dresses that daughters had no interest in wearing, toothpaste samples from the dentist, love poems written by boyfriends long ago. The ships brought it and slipped it into the water when no one was watching, and once in the water, it vanished completely. Spools of film that no one remembered how to process, dolls with broken arms, income tax information that went back more than 7 years, half-eaten cupcakes, half-read novels, shrunken sweaters, chipped teacups. From the outside, with perspective, it all looked smoothed and beautiful. The island's perfect peak, the sun forever setting or forever rising and never stuck at a punishing noonday height. But on the island itself, where even the idea of perspective did not exist, everything arrived in its particularity. From the island, it was the ships that seemed a single entity. What was discarded was unique. Who discarded it was not. From a distance, living on an island is lots of children's dream. No parents, no bedtime, no need to grow up. Mermaids and pirates in the water, lost boys living underground. From a distance, living in an island is lots of parents' nightmare. Children turning into savages, rival factions raiding one another's camps, flies buzzing around the rotting heads of carcasses. From either distance, the children ultimately leave. From either distance, the island gets tucked away as something to imagine, but never to believe in. And because these little chapters get progressively darker as the novel goes on, and because it's kind of a celebration to be reading it for with other people, I wanted to end my reading with a very short passage that is kind of a moment of reprieve within the growing darkness of the novel. The children stayed down by the water while the sun set. They were still down by the water when the moon came out. On that island, when there were no clouds, the stars were always bright. It didn't matter if the moon was full and hogging half the sky. The stars formed a tight path over the crown of night, and Louise had easily dreamed of walking that path into heaven. When they finally stepped away from the water and headed back up to the hut, Natasha was clutching a starfish in her hand. Inside, she curled up on her mat, the starfish pressed to her cheek, and Louisa curled up next to her. She listened to the sleepy sighs that filled the room. She heard Otis's snoring, the heavy snoring of an adult so different from the delicate snoring of children. She heard the pigs sigh outside and faint trails of music drifting from the villa, and bordering it all like a ribbon around the hem of a dress, she heard the gentle sea. So that's where I'll end my reading. for today. Thank you so much for being here and listening to it. And I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has.
So Mary Lou Bagley says, stunning opening, the detail pulls me onward. And she just said, oh my.
Well, thank you.
So how'd you get, what's your background in writing? What brought you to a book about environmental and having the pigs as you know, the animal of choice, and all the other things that you talk about throughout the book?
Sure. My background is I started writing pretty seriously in my early 20s. And once I started writing fiction, I just kind of, like everything else that I was doing, it seemed like the only productive way to build meaning in my life at that time. And I published my first novel when I was in my early 30s. And at the same time that I published my novel, in fact, a month after that novel's publication date, I gave birth to my first child. And I had sort of been convinced the whole time that I was pregnant that it really, like, having children would not affect my writing at all. I was under the impression that babies slept a lot and that I would be able to get writing done while the baby was asleep. But that in fact didn't happen. And over the years that followed, I had a second child, and I found that after they were really small, I had time to write again, but that there was a kind of confusion that was going on inside of me between the kind of protectiveness that I felt towards my children and my desire to shield them from that which is dangerous in the world, and the aims of fiction, which require characters being put in risk, right? When there's no risk in fiction, it tends to be kind of boring fiction. There needs to be risk. But every time I wrote scenes in which characters were put in jeopardy in some way, I could not resist an authorial impulse to, like, reach in and save them. So an example of it is I worked on a novel for a long time that one of the main characters was a teenage boy, and one night he leaves a party in the wintertime in a terrible snowstorm, and he's driving and his car swerves on the road and circles around, and rather than following that towards a dangerous conclusion, I just had his car land very softly in a snowbank. And so I felt like the aims of myself as a mother and the aims of myself as a fiction writer were pretty strongly at odds. And once I kind of was able to articulate that to myself, I decided that probably the best way to move past this particular issue was to write a novel that featured children in particularly vulnerable positions. And so I was really deliberate about wanting to write about children in a dangerous situation, because I felt like that would help me move past the kinds of writing blocks that I was experiencing. So that's part of where the characters in the novel come from. But at the same time, as that was going on, I live in a small town in Eastern Washington, and we moved from the city portion of the town, which is, really small anyway, to the county. And when we moved to the county, we lost curbside recycling. And we tend to be really very lazy about bringing our recycling to the recycling center. And so it would just build up on our back porch, like mountains of packaging that needed to go to the recycling center to be recycled. And I just started becoming really obsessed with the unnecessary packaging that, all of our products come in, and the waste that we create, and somehow having it there, like the visuals of it on my back porch, and realizing how much garbage one single family creates, started me, thinking about environmental issues on a large scale. and just started me thinking about like all the things that I loved so much as a child that no doubt are at the bottom of the ocean right now. So that was a big part of it too. And then at the same time that we moved from the city to the county, we got chickens. And our chickens were like, you know, such a salvation in terms of our disposable food waste. They would just eat everything. And I just started thinking like, oh my God, maybe what if there were like some magical creatures that could do the same thing for the entire world's garbage? You know, given the way that we treat the resources in our world, we probably wouldn't even appreciate them, and we'd probably end up damaging them also. So that's kind of where the idea for the pigs came from. And then the final source that I think I have to acknowledge is that I think I started reading this, writing this the morning after having watched an episode of the television show Criminal Minds, which is like the FBI tracking down serial killers. And in that particular episode, there was a serial killer who fed his victims to the pigs. And the only thing that was left over were shoes. And so that's part of why they eat shoes in that first opening section, because my pigs eat everything. They don't leave anything behind. So those are some of the sources.
Very, very interesting. So we have Susan Barton, one of our guests. She has a couple questions to ask for you. I will ask her to unmute and start her video here and let her ask her questions. Hi, Susan.
Hello.
Hi, is that Susan Lee?
Hi, Susan Lee, yes.
Nice to see you. This is
you. Oops. Dark. I was just wondering what the impact of writing this was on you. You talked about, you know, wanting you to be protective of children. So writing about children that are in these roles and writing a dark plot, how did that impact you? And were there times when you just had to stop and couldn't deal with it? Or I was just curious.
You know, it was once I started writing about it, I just kind of couldn't stop. But one of the ways that it impacted me is that, you know, I started thinking out about my own children, and then I just couldn't, like, there was no place that I could turn where I didn't read about children in vulnerable situations worldwide. Like, it just seemed like as soon as I started thinking about vulnerabilities of children, there they were, like, everywhere in the globe. Those with the most power are treated in the most horrible ways. And I really started writing it during the summer of 2014. And during that summer, there were several incidents where undocumented children were in Southern California, were being moved from one facility to another in buses. And there were several stories where American adults surrounded the buses, like yelling at the kids in the buses. And I just couldn't stop thinking about that image and thinking about the ways in which adults just don't often refuse to recognize that a child is a child and needs to be nourished and taken care of, and instead position them as in these really awful ways. And so I felt like it sort of opened my eyes to be able to see parts of the world that before perhaps I had looked away from. I think you're
Great.
muted.
Thank you. Oh.
Thank you for the book. It's a gift.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for reading it.
So you also have another book called City of Ghosts. Do you want to talk about that for a little bit. And now that's your first book, correct?
That's right. And that's the book that was published right before my son was born. And it's a funny thing because so it came out in 2003, so quite a long time ago. And when I read it now, it doesn't really feel like it was written by me anymore. Like there are lines in it that I read that I'm like, oh, right, that I remember writing that line, but a lot of it feels sort of mysterious. I'm like, where did this come from? You know, who wrote this book? So it's sort of an interesting kind of way to track my life. And I'd be interested in hearing from Mary Lou whether she has that same experience with books that she has written. But just plot-wise, it's much more conventional than Pigs. It takes place in the world that we all know and can access. It follows a young woman who gives up her life in New York City kind of on a whim to follow a guy that she's in love with to Nepal. And they establish a life there that is really a life that's established on his terms rather than hers. And the main part of the novel is kind of like the dissolution of that love story and the kind of growing awareness of the woman as an independent person. And the plot does not follow my life at all, but I did spend a fair amount of time when I was a young woman living in Nepal. So I knew that country well enough to set a story there. And it allowed me to, you know, think about a lot of questions that I had when I was living there.
Great. Mary Lou, would you like to speak with, sorry, I'm trying to do like three things at once here. Respond to Joanna's question?
Absolutely. I did not write my first novel until recently, and I'm not a young woman anymore, but I do look back at my earlier works and my short stories and poetry, because I was more of a short fiction writer before. And I experienced just what you're talking about. Did I say that? Did that come from here? And it is a wonderful way to track sort of your own broadening, deepening, a little bit of wisdom maybe here and there, and very different subject matter than I'm interested in writing about now. And I do have to say, I just so wish I didn't have to leave a little early because I am so fascinated by you and this book. I really enjoyed how much you told us about your process in terms of what brought you to this particular subject. I so identify with the mother instinct to not want to put children or any vulnerable being in danger. And yet, like you say, you know, fiction is if there's no risk. Your prose is stunning. Your details, some of them have this hint of humor in them because as we're listening to the things that people discard, it's like, oh yeah, I identify. And just the simple, you know, the tax returns that are older than 7 years, because that's of course when we can get rid of them. But not just that, I just wanted to note every detail. I go, oh, and then you'd be on to the next one that I wanted to note. So the selection of details is just stunning. I can't wait to get the book. And I must admit, when you first started talking about the subject matter, I thought, I think I'd have to be in the mood. I don't know what that mood would be, you know, to face the very topic that you're talking about. But the minute you started to read, and I heard that lyrical prose, I thought, I have to get this book.
Oh,
and I love the idea of the short paragraphs and the role that they serve in the book. Again, I'm just, thank you, Chris Upton. And thank you, Johanna.
You're
Is it
welcome.
Johanna or Joanna?
Johanna.
Johanna. Yes, this has just been such a treat. I could stay a little longer. I'm going to stay longer than I'm supposed to.
Well, good,
Thank you so
because
much.
my next question for Johanna is, you had mentioned that when you were trying to decide, you could go a mystical creature, or you decided on the pigs. Why not go the more fantasy route than more actual or live?
You know, I just really, I mean, I just love pigs, but I also just really loved the way I could like play with values by having pigs, because I just really loved creating pigs that were beautiful, and having like the idea of, you know, something that we often use as an epithet be actually like a source of salvation. And so I just really, like, I was just really invested in the pigs. For a while, I kind of thought that the title was a little bit too in your face. And I was kind of considering calling the novel From a Distance, which is how all of those very short chapters start. But I was just so attached to the pigs that I had to keep its name what it was. But I guess one thing that I think would happen if you created a kind of mystical creature is that you wouldn't be able to play with reader expectation at all. And that for me is kind of a fun thing about writing, is kind of like pressing back against assumptions that I think my readers will make. I just wanted to respond to something that Mary Lou said about the details of the garbage. I definitely like, there's a lot of things that privately make me laugh in the novel, and a lot of that has to do with like those lists of garbage that I create. And the income tax information, that's just like, I'm so weighed down, like I'm afraid to throw away my old tax forms, and they just pile up, you know, like in my closet. So there's some sort of like therapeutic stuff that's going on in those lists of being like, oh, I just need to find a way to get rid of this stuff.
So what is your writing? One of the things, we've had a couple workshops here, and each one has talked about how they start their work. Do they do an outline, or obviously you have an idea of what you want to say? Do you break it up into an outline form? Do you just sort of not necessarily wing it, but kind of go and take notes? Do you write it? Do you use the computer to write everything, or do you handwrite everything first? What's your writing process?
Those are great questions. So I will say I'm zooming in from the room that I write in. So this is where I write. I feel like I'm one of those novelists who's probably like most novelists, who feels like they don't know how to write a novel. Like, I don't know the right way to do it. And I wish that I could outline or have the plot set in place before I start. I would really love to write like a detective novel where I knew the parts and how they unfold before I started, but I haven't quite figured out how to do that. And so generally what happens is I generally get like words rattling around in my head. Like, I had the first sentence of the novel, "The pigs ate everything," that like I just woke up with that in my head in the morning. And I write really early in the morning. Ideally, I get up at like 5 in the morning and, you know, write for an hour or so until other people in my house are awake. I really like writing in the dark. I don't like writing at night, but I like writing in the morning dark. And so I tend to give myself like word limits for the day. So I try to write 1,000 words a day, and I just sit down and write. And I feel like if I find that if I do it the first thing when I get up, it's just there ready to go. Whereas if I wait, then a kind of anxiety builds in that I won't be able to do it, or that it will be kind of torturous, or whatever it is. So I find that it's really important to just start right away. And with the project that I'm working on now, that's my process for writing. But then I've also been trying to keep really careful note about ideas that spring into my mind during the day, so that I have a kind of more directed sense of the plot than maybe I have in the past. So there's an element of discovery in terms of what the plot is, but also a kind of shaping along with that discovery. And I write directly onto the computer. I use a program called Scrivener, which I really love, which allows you to create separate documents for each chapter, each section, but then compiles them all together for you. And it kind of gets away from the unwieldiness of writing in a big Word document, in that you can just very easily move around sections as the whole project starts to become clearer.
Do you ever, do you carry around ever been out like to the grocery store or a gas station or a friend's house or something and have another couple lines or a couple paragraphs that you want to include? Did you, like, when we opened the store, I got myself one of those phones there that you can write notes on, you know, the note phone, Android phones there. Do you have something like that? Do you carry around a notepad? Do you carry around a digital voice recorder so you can remember?
I always have a notepad with me. I usually I use it for a lot of different things, but one of the things that I like to keep it for is like when titles of projects jump into my mind. So I like to keep track of the titles, like even though I don't know what the project is yet, I have a name for it. And that's actually another part of my writing process, is it's really hard for me to work on something if it doesn't have a name. So that's something I do. And then I have a separate notebook that I keep that's all about what I'm thinking about in terms of plot. Plot is like the hardest element of writing for me. So I like to be able to kind of work it out on paper.
Do you ever do any of those? Well, there's one in particular I think that comes up in November. It's called Nanowrimo. I forget what the big long spelled out name for it is, but have you ever done any of those to challenge yourself or to help yourself?
I haven't, but I would love to. I think that would be the greatest thing. But I'm always teaching in November, and so it's just never, it's never the right time for me. But I do I generally am done teaching for the summer mid-May, and generally between mid-May and mid-July, I write every single day. And if you write 1,000 words a day for 2 months, you end up with 60,000 words, which is, you know, almost as long as a novel. So that's a really productive time for me in terms of generating rough draft material that then I can kind of go back to during the rest of the year.
Do you have any rituals that you do before you start writing, or is it just, I'm sure sometimes you have just a quick idea, so you write down or sit down real quick and write that out. But if you're saying, okay, I'm done, I'm ready, let's go, let's start some writing, do you grab a cup of tea or a glass of whiskey, or do you do some sort of mantra or something before you start writing? Do you have your whole desk set up and everything in its place or whatever to sort of get you in the mood to write?
Well, I do always write in the same place, right? So I'm kind of conditioned when I sit down, that's the work that I'm doing. Since I write in the morning, and since I write pretty much as soon as I wake up in the morning, I have like a giant pot of coffee that I'm drinking the whole time, which is very nice because it immediately focuses my brain. But beyond that, I don't really have any rituals. My desk tends to be extremely messy all the time. I guess that there are like certain places in my house that I go to when I'm revising. Like if I print out a draft, I'm kind of always sitting in the same place when I'm going through it. But other than that, I don't I don't really have anything except that, like, just kind of clean morning mind that is important for me.
Was it difficult when your son was growing up to have that alone time to sit and write and be a parent at the same time?
Yeah, it was really, really hard. And that's why I started getting up so early in the morning. And that was kind of like the limit for me. So it was like my kids got up at 7 to get ready for school, and I got up at 5, and I would have that kind of stretch of time. And then I got very upset when they went into middle school and school starting earlier, because it just felt like it really squeezed into my morning time. And then high school started even earlier, but luckily they don't really need me in the morning anymore. So everybody in my family knows to just leave me alone when I'm in the morning, when I'm in my office. And they're really supportive and respectful of that.
Yeah, I get that morning thing because I get up at 5:30 or so, and we're empty nesters now, so it's nice. But even still, everybody knows, just leave me alone in the morning. Y'all stay in bed, and I enjoy waking up when the sun comes up and just the nice quietness of the house. So what kind of switch from writing to reading? What types of books do you like to read? Do you have a particular genre that you just always like to read, or is it a mood thing? Where do you like to read? And
I like to read pretty much any fiction. I guess I like to read on my couch. That's where I generally read. And I am really happy to read any genre. The only thing that is important to me is that the prose feel like it moves along in a rhythm that I can understand. I get really like just thrown off when I can't find my way into the rhythms of what it is I'm reading. But at the same time, I also find my writing is really influenced by the rhythms of what I'm reading, and sometimes it becomes really frustrating to start writing in the morning and realizing that I'm mimicking something that I've read the day before. And so a lot of times if I'm writing pretty intensely, I tend not to read. But otherwise, I kind of like reading anything. I'm reading this really cool book right now called Talking Animals by Joni Murphy, who she and I are going to be doing an event together in November, and her novel takes place in New York City, but it's a New York City that's populated by animals, and it follows one particular llama who lives in New York. So I like the kind of strangeness of it, like the way that it makes us rethink the ordinary. It's really great. I read Kevin Wilson's There's Nothing to See Here this summer, and I really loved it, which is follows the life of this kind of broken young woman who's hired to be the nanny of her former best friend's stepchildren who have some kind of condition which makes them combustible. And so she's like takes care of these children who periodically like burst into flames. And again, I just really like that combination of the very strange within an ordinary circumstance. Well, it looks like Mary Lou is going. So thank you so much for being here today. It was really nice to meet you.
Yeah, thank you, Mary Lou. So do you have a guilty pleasure book that you just, customer came into the store and just says, I like to read this type of book. This is usually what I stick with, but I heard about this one. It just sounds like a guilty pleasure. I just want something to take to the beach, sit down and just read, just kind of blow through real quick, just to kind of get my mind off stuff. Is that just typically kind of what you read, or because being a writer, you just kind of want to get your mind in a different mindset, or is it just something that's you read that was just like, yeah, I just want to read this because it just.
Oh, well, I don't know. Like so I'm really obsessed with The Name of the Wind. You know that book by Patrick Rothfuss? It's like a high fantasy novel that follows this young musician slash wizard kind of character named Quoth. And it's totally outside of the genres that I normally read. I mean, I love fantasy, but that's not usually what I go first to pick up, but I just love it so much. And so like, if I'm looking for a book that's going to just be relaxing for me, like a lot of times I'll go back and reread that. I've read it several times. It's so good. So that's one. I guess I really love, the Kurt Wallander mystery novels that I read kind of for mood and for plot. So those are some really good ones, or, like Scandinavian mystery kind of stuff. I love.
Nice. Yeah. I loved it because I read a lot of nonfiction. So every once in a while, I like to go to like a Terry Brooks or Anne McCaffrey, just something fantasy to go through. I did read one, and this is the one the customer came in for, was Mexican Gothic. Just came out over the summer there.
Yeah.
Typically not something that I would read, but I did do it, and it was a phenomenal book, and it was just kind of was able to get right through it and sort of reset things, from things that are going out in the world and things with business here and just some of the other things that I have to read. It was just nice to cleanse the palate, I guess, with just something that would kind of flow.
That sounds great. Maybe I'll check that out.
Yeah. So we always get a lot of questions, aspiring authors that come in asking about publishing and ways to publish. Of course, we have our suggestions. What was your route to get published, especially with your first one, and then even with your second one, if you went a different route for that? What are some tips that you can give some of our watchers and listeners who'll see this about the do's and don'ts or the traps of publishing?
Well, I think it really depends on whether you're trying to publish short fiction or you're publishing a novel length work. So for short fiction, I just send it out to literary journals, find the journals that publish work that I admire, and then send it out and expect to get rejections, because, it takes, 10 or 15 submissions before you get something accepted. So that's pretty easy. And I think that the key there is to really read their submission guidelines very clearly. Don't send them work that falls out. It can only be 10 pages. Don't send them something that's 11 pages. So that's the advice I would give for short fiction. And then for me, I was really fortunate to find a literary agent pretty quickly. I had the help of a friend of mine who worked in publishing, and she recommended me to several agents. And so I kind of had an introduction to them, and I've been working with the same agent since, for a very long time. And so if you have an agent, then it of course makes the submission process much, much easier. And so she was able to kind of figure out what editor she thought would be interested in my work, and was able to find a home pretty quickly for my first novel. But Pigs is like a way stranger novel than that first novel was. And it was hard to kind of sell it in commercial terms. And so she and I decided that it would be more appropriate maybe for an independent publisher. And so that's how it ended up with Red Hen Press, because they're a pretty big size independent publisher, but they're really willing to support books that kind of fall outside of the mainstream or are willing to take kind of formal risks or experimental risks or be driven more by questions about the world than saleability of plot or what have you. And so it has been a really wonderful experience working with Red Hen, and I feel so fortunate to have ended up with them. I think that they were exactly the right kind of publisher to publish the book.
So definitely don't count out small independent publishers.
Oh yeah, and I mean, for sure. Yeah.
So how did you choose? Did you choose the cover for Pigs? Did you design it? What was the process of getting? Because one of the things we get here is, of course, you judge a book by its cover, and we've had some books come through here. Authors were asking us to carry their books, and just the cover just doesn't deliver what the book or reflect what the book is about. And it's an unfortunate thing because it's a good book. I read it and it's good, but I love this one. You can obviously tell a little bit about what the idea of it is. So did you choose that? Did somebody do it for you, or how does that process as far as picking, and what's the most important thing about having a cover done?
Red Hen has an in-house art director, and she designs their covers. And so what she did is she made a couple different ideas that she was working with. And I just really loved this idea, the idea of the pigs, like the broken up bodies of the pigs. And so, once I was able to tell them which of the ideas that they were thinking about felt most right to me, then she took it and really designed it. So I feel unbelievably fortunate that this is the cover that she came up with. I just love it, and I think it's so beautiful. And I'm pretty obsessed with book covers, and I had all of these images in my mind of what like the cover would be like, and none of them were this. And then when I saw it and I thought like, oh, this is exactly right. Like this is what a visual artist can do that a writer can't do, is that they can translate the feel of a novel into a cover. So that's how that happened. And I guess one of the things that I felt like I had this kind of subway test for myself, which is like, if you're riding on the subway in New York and you see somebody holding a book, like, is that a book that you yourself would want to read? So that's kind of what I was thinking about it. Like, if I saw somebody else holding it, would I be drawn to it? And it looks like, Susan Lee, it looks like you are going to be heading off soon. So thank you so much for coming. It was really lovely to have you here, and thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So I don't remember what the other question was. I think here there was so definitely, well, here's something that again, some aspiring authors that have come in. What about self-publishing? Did you ever think of self-publishing? And
I mean, not in any serious way. There was a time when I felt like that the material in Pigs was really urgent, that it felt really urgent that people read it. But I guess there's something about the like collaborative nature of working with a publisher, working with an editor, feeling like there's a whole kind of group of people who are supporting it that I really wanted. And so that would be a reason that I wasn't thinking very hard about self-publishing.
Do you use beta readers, or like friends and family say, hey, test this out, or is that just something that's worked through with your agent and your publisher? Or do you go out and say, hey, here, I got this beta copy, check it out and let me know what you think?
Oh, I have a ton of readers. My mother is a really
Mhm.
great reader for me. I have, a friend of mine who's also a novelist. She and I have swapped our novels and given each other, detailed feedback on it. I have a lot of friends who have been really, really generous with me in terms of not just reading, but also responding with great specificity to questions I ask them. So one of the things that I often ask people to read for is pacing. Can you just read it and be aware of like when you get bored, when the plot seems to slow down, where you get confused? And I think that that's absolutely key, especially in all parts of the process, but especially before sending it out for publishers to make a decision about it. That it just seems like you want to get it in as great shape for your readers as you can before asking somebody to commit to it.
Okay. And you said you had a couple projects when we were talking about if you write things down and things like that. You have a couple projects in the works. One, how do you keep them separate? So if you have, say, a couple working titles, how do you keep those two ideas, those two stories separate? And would you mind talking about them? What's coming down the road from you?
Yeah, so I don't have a good answer to that. Like, uh, I kind of just tend to like store one a little bit and hold it. Like I have the title and I have some ideas, but I kind of put it on hold because I have a big problem with not finishing things. And so if I start too many things, then chances are that none of them will get finished. But the novel I'm working on right now, it's I won't tell you very about the plot, but the form of it is that each chapter responds to a particular fairy tale. So it's kind of a net of fairy tales, and it takes place on a small family farm in which each of the characters is kind of connected to plot points in various fairy tales in particular ways.
When can we look forward to that one?
I don't know. Soon,
No
I
pressure.
hope.
No
Soon, I
pressure.
hope. We'll see.
Hey.
Yeah.
Cool. Good.
Well,
So we're you're definitely safe from, so on a personal note, you're definitely safe from all the fires and everything. That's,
I
you
am.
were mentioned that it is kind of dark over there because the smoke's
Mhm.
getting to you. You're in Eastern Washington.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think the smoke is going to be here until Monday or Tuesday, but we're so fortunate that we're not actually in the line of where the wildfires actually are. So we just need to stay inside
Yeah.
and keep our doors and windows shut.
And you're staying safe and everything from the pandemic, and
Yeah. Yeah.
that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
So we got a few minutes left. Is there anything else you'd like to mention or talk
No,
about?
I'm just so grateful for this event. It's been so lovely, talking together. And it's such an interesting thing to be zooming to the other side of the country. And I feel like
It
that's
is,
one of
yeah.
the things that the pandemic has made really clear is that we do have this ability to like cover great distances in an immediate way, which if there's anything to be grateful for, I think that's it.
Are you doing any in-person events
No,
at all?
I
I know
had
some
what's
bookstores are open, and I have seen some authors do, wearing masks and social distancing and stuff, and 6-foot tables and things like that. But have you done any of those? Or
I haven't. All of the events that I had lined up last spring either went virtual or were canceled. So I was scheduled to go to some literary festivals, and I was scheduled to do readings here and there. And then I was going to do an in-person reading this summer in Oregon, but the bookstore and I both kind of decided that it just wasn't like, they didn't want to bring a crowd into their store, and I didn't really want to be around a crowd of people, even wearing masks. And so we just decided to do it virtually as well. And I think that that's likely going to be the way that it is for me for a little while. Hopefully not too much longer. It's really, there's something really, really wonderful about being able to spend time with readers in person. I miss it a lot. But I just think that for right now, it's not the right time for me.
So you mentioned earlier too that before we went live that your husband is from Hampton, New Hampshire.
Yeah.
So, hopefully when this all blows over and settles down and stuff, next time you're in town, we can have you come in person.
That would be great. I would love that.
So,
yeah.
Well, we're going to go, we'll go ahead and end it now, unless you have anything else.
No, that's it. I just want to say thank you again. This was really lovely. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. So just to wrap this up, Johanna Stoberock, the author of Pigs, the novel, is available here in the store. It does come with a signed book plate, which is her signature on a nice decorative sticker that you can put inside the book, so it kind of makes it a signed copy. So we have a bunch of those while they last. Of course, we have your email address, so we could always request more if we need more, and hopefully we will need more. It's also available through bookshop.org. You can get to that through our website, our link on our website to our landing page there. And of course, you have your website as well. And I'm not going to mention He Who Shall Not Be Named. Okay. Some people get that joke. Anyways, but thank you very much for doing this with us, and definitely let us know when you're going to be in the area, and if nothing else, have you come in and sign some more books, or just do a non-event, and
that sounds great. Thank you.
Get some selfies.
All right, sounds good. Okay, have a good afternoon.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Bye.